Hello, and a very warm welcome to 10 practical ideas for developing self-regulation with me, Sue Cowley, for teachit.co.uk. So before we move on to the practical ideas, let's take a quick look at what self-regulation actually is. So basically, it's a set of what we call executive functions, which are a little bit like an air traffic control system for your brain. And the three key executive functions involved are working memory, mental flexibility, and self-control. And these three things working together support children in building this set of skills. So children become aware of and understand what their own behaviours are and become more able to manage them. So when they feel an impulse, they gradually learn how to control that impulse. And they gradually learn to do what we call deferred gratification, which is where we take a long-term view in terms of what rewards we want to receive. So rather than immediately grabbing for something, we are able to control our impulses and wait for that longer-term, more extensive reward. And if you think about it, this reflects what school is like. The more able you are to control your impulses in the short term, the more likely you are to do better in the longer term. So some of the other skills involved in self-regulation include a set of behaviours that are very clearly linked to learning. So these are the behaviours where children learn how to maintain their focus on something or someone or what someone is saying, and where they also learn to manage distractions, so they become more able to cope when there are things that could potentially distract them, and they decide where to direct their attention. Then self-regulation is also about emotional control, emotional regulation, and it's about children starting to understand what they feel, being able to name those feelings and being able to calm themselves where those feelings might be of frustration or anger. And this all ties very closely into the ability to empathise, to see other people's perspectives, to be able to position yourself in somebody else's view of the world. And then self-regulation also involves a set of behaviours around planning and managing goals. So it allows children to become more able to plan for their learning, to plan for what they want to do when they're facing a challenge, and also to cope well with challenges and failing at those challenges. So being able to pick themselves up when things are difficult for them. And this all ties very neatly into this idea of agency, a sense that children develop of themselves as active agents within their world, as being able to have an influence on how they make their way through the world in which they live. So in the early years and beyond, children move from something we called co-regulation to the skill of self-regulation. And co-regulation is basically where the adults work with the children to support them in regulating their behaviours, in regulating their emotions. And a really good way to understand this is thinking about climbing muddy banks as a small child. So a small child can't necessarily climb a steep muddy bank easily or on their own at all. But what adults can do is they can co-regulate to support them. So they might give them a little physical help. They might push them up or pull them up the bank, at the same time encouraging them to do as much of the physical work for themselves as possible. They might use language to support the child and say things like, "Come on, you can do it. That's it. Just push a little harder. I know you can manage this." And those are co-regulations. If the child gets upset while they're trying to get up the muddy bank, the adult might help them calm themselves and say things like, "I can see you're getting upset, so let's just pause for a moment and breathe, and then we can try again, and I'll give you more support." And this co-regulation can gradually be removed from the child as the child learns more and more how to manage their own self-regulation. Now, self-regulation in research links very, very closely to strong academic outcomes, but it also links very, very closely to strong outcomes in all aspects of our lives. And the research shows that this skill and the influence it has holds true right through to when we're adults as well. So it's not just something that's important for schoolwork, it's also important in our lives beyond school. Let's move on now to the practical ideas. And the first idea is to create routines that are clearly understood by everyone, but also, and crucially, to offer the children an element of agency within those routines. Now, the great thing about routines is they offer children a feeling of security. They know what's coming, they know what's expected of them, they know what the adults want them to do. And where all the adults are very clear that they want exactly the same routine in place, that emphasises the routine and creates this lovely feeling of consistency and certainty. And this leads through to the children feeling more secure. Now, within the routines that you create, what you're looking for is opportunities for the children to have a sense of agency. And just to give you one idea of how we do that in our setting, that will give you a perfect example of how this works. So when the children arrive in the morning, they're going to self-register. And one of the things they need to do in order to do that is to look through the box of names and to find their name. And because they're very young, because they're early years, and they maybe can't yet necessarily recognise their names, they have a little symbol that goes with it, which they have chosen, and that helps them find their name. So that's the first bit of agency. I have to find my own name. And then they have to self-register on a board that offers them a choice of milk or water. And so they are making a choice. They are playing an active role and having agency over the things that are going to happen to them. And that, again, feeds into their development of self-regulation. Now for our second idea. And this is to constantly name the emotions you spot that you observe in your children and to be really explicit about it. Now, the reason you need to do this is because you're helping children start to understand their own behaviours. And behaviours are just essentially about the things we do in relation to other things in our world. So I behave in a happy way, I behave in a sad way, I behave in an angry way because of the things in my world that affect me. So it's about an interaction with the world, really. And all the time your children are interacting with the world around them and they will be feeling emotions. But at first they won't necessarily be able to recognise what those emotions are. Now, one thing that we don't want to be doing is constantly damping down these emotions. We want children to be able to recognise them, name them, be comfortable with them, but to be able to cope with them as well. So you notice that a child in your class is getting a bit upset about something. So rather than going to them something like, "Why are you getting upset? What are you worried about?" Don't do it that way. Just say to them, "Oh, I notice that you're looking a bit unhappy there." Or, "I notice that you're struggling with something here." So try and frame it in a way that you are simply noticing something, you're observing something. And it can also help to actually name what you see. So I notice that your face is a bit screwed up here. I notice that your forehead is all scrunched up. I notice that your body's looking a bit tense. When my body feels tense, that tends to mean that I'm getting a bit irritated or angry or upset. And what you're essentially doing is providing a narrative, providing a description of how human beings feel emotions, are able to name them, and then you can offer the child strategies to start to handle those emotions. Not to make them go away, but to acknowledge that they are having them and to be able to cope with them. So idea number 3 is to praise agency rather than attainment. And this is all about supporting the child to feel that they are an active agent within their world, but also in relation to the learning that they do in your classroom or in your setting. So if we praise attainment all the time, if we constantly go, oh, what a fantastic picture, oh, aren't you a clever child, oh, isn't that wonderful, we give the child the feeling that they have a kind of wonderfulness about them, that they're not necessarily active agents in achieving that wonderfulness. So we need to frame it by using language to describe what it is the child has done actively to make their work better. So you might say something like, instead of what a wonderful picture, you might say something like, I noticed that you're really getting much more confident in the way that you paint the sky. I love the way you've chosen red to describe the sunset, the colours of the sunset there. Can you tell me a bit about why you chose that particular tone of red? And by doing that, you're encouraging the child to see that they played an active role in making that picture better, rather than this kind of generalisation of what a wonderful picture, what a wonderful piece of work. And it's that explicit naming of what the child has done actively which will feed into their development of self-regulation. So idea number 4 is all about mistakes and making genuine mistakes and being able to find solutions to those mistakes for yourself. Now, we talk a lot about making mistakes in education, and we even make up acronyms for this. And people use the acronym FAIL at the moment. They say failure is a first attempt in learning. But a lot of the time, we need to ask ourselves, are we genuinely letting the children make mistakes and choose to throw something away if they're not happy with it? Or are we over-scaffolding things for them? Are we letting them kind of make a slight mistake but then jumping in too early? So one of the things you need to do in order to boost self-regulation is to enable children to actually make real mistakes and to cope with their mistakes and to repair them for themselves. And one way in which you can do this, a really simple idea, is if you're looking at a child's piece of work and you notice there's an error in it, don't immediately scaffold it and tell the child how to repair the error. Simply point to the error and say, I notice you've made a little mistake here, but I reckon that you can figure out what the mistake is and how to solve it for yourself. And then walk away. Go and support another child for a moment, but keep an eye on that child and just make sure, are they coping, or do they need a bit more support, a bit more scaffolding, a bit more co-regulation? And you will know for yourself whether it looks like the child is becoming too frustrated by trying to correct their own mistakes, or whether that level of challenge is a real benefit for them. And this is very much a gradual process. This all links back to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. You don't want to throw a massive challenge at a child that they won't be able to cope with, but all the time you need to just be gradually inching up the level of challenge for every single child. It's often the case that classrooms are places of kind of constant activity. And one of the important things for the development of self-regulation is that children learn to be patient and wait. And that's what idea number 5 is about. Now I'm going to explain this idea just by giving you a couple of very simple examples. So one way of getting children to be patient and to wait for something is to do an activity that involves patience. Something like growing their own vegetables or flowers from seed. They have to be willing to wait for the seed to germinate, then gradually follow its progress, and wait for it to flower or wait for it to produce crops for them. So that's one way of doing it. Another way of doing this is to just incorporate something into your daily routine where the children are asked to control the impulse to go somewhere. And I'll just explain what we do in our setting. So we play something called the Ready Ready game. And this is at the end of carpet time before the children go off into the continuous provision. And they're sat on the carpet and the practitioner goes to them, ready, ready. And then she goes, not just yet. And then she goes again, ready, ready. And the children they know it's going to be a signal to go and play. And they want to go and play. And she goes, not just yet. And she does this maybe 3 or 4 times each day. And the children learn that feeling of being about to go and do something, feeling the impulse, and then reining in that urge just for a moment. And again, it's about building these things up gradually, not expecting it to go on for ages the first time round, but just gradually increasing the level of challenge. Idea number 6 is thinking about who is doing most of the work in your classroom or in your setting of managing the behaviour. And you should be kind of constantly reflecting on this question, because if the answer to this question all the time is that the adults are doing most of the work, then something is going slightly wrong. Now, I must acknowledge at this point that there are some classrooms in which the adults have to work incredibly hard to try and manage behaviour and to try and get the children to come to them. But where we can work with the children when they're much younger to support the development of impulse control, of self-regulation, then they should be better able as they get older and become teenagers to do those things for themselves. Now, one really good way of thinking about this is, how do you get the class to come to you? Do you stand at the front calling to them, come to me everybody, come to me, 3, 2, 1, come to me, come to me? Is it always about you, the adult, doing all the work? Or do you sometimes get the children to do more work than you? So to give one simple example, in our setting, one of the children rings a small handbell. I'll show you, I've got one here. So they ring a small handbell when it's time to come to the carpet. So the lovely thing about that is that the child has agency over their peers, so a bit of agency over their world. We're using an oral signal rather than a verbal one, so the children have to listen out. And then the practitioner can simply come and wait for the children to join her. And gradually look around and highlight, that's fantastic, you're ready to start, you're ready to start. So positive reinforcement where the children have done more work of the behaviour than the adults. You might have come across the saying, don't be a helicopter. And you might have heard people talking about helicopter parents. And these are the parents who are kind of constantly hovering over their children. Do this, do that. They have a social calendar for them that they're going to fill out completely. Every minute of their time is factored into the day. And teachers can have a bit of a habit of doing this as well. I know I can be guilty of this. Because you want your children to do well. So the temptation is to overhelp, to over-scaffold, to over-support, particularly if you feel under a great deal of pressure in terms of accountability or perhaps from managers asking you to achieve certain things that your children would struggle to achieve. But ironically, the more you put things in the hands of the children, the more you step back, you step away, the better in the long run it will be for them. And there's an early years author called Julie Fisher who wrote a book all about whether we are interacting with children or interfering with them. And that's a really useful question to ask yourself. Does this interaction with the child tip over into me interfering with them? Am I allowing them enough agency, enough kind of self-regulation that they are able to do things in the way that they want to do them? And it does require a leap of faith. It requires you to trust that the children will come to the right decisions in the end and do the right things in the end. But in the long run, it is better for their development of self-regulation. One of the key factors in the development of self-regulation is what happens in the home, right from the earliest days. And one of the things we can do as settings is to support parents in helping their children to develop self-regulation. Now, some of the factors in the home that feed into the development of self-regulation are things like very secure attachments. So the child has a secure attachment to a trusted carer or carers, and the child feels more able to take risks, to manage challenges, to take chances with their learning. So that's one of the factors. Another factor is where parents give sufficient levels of challenge to their child, and that's both physical challenges and intellectual challenge. And then another factor is where parents understand how to support the development of agency. And this ties into what I was saying earlier about trying not to be a helicopter, trying not to hover too closely over children. Now, this is a very, very natural parenting instinct. You want to help your child. You want to support your child. They're very little. You want to do things for them. But actually, right from very early on, so we have 2-year-olds in our settings who can take their own coats off, find the right peg, hang them up, put them back on again. They can free flow in and out of the setting during the day to the outdoor area, and they can cope perfectly well with doing these things for themselves. But as parents, we have this urge to overhelp. So what can be very useful for your parents is simply to do a workshop on how some of these self-regulation skills develop. And it's these partnerships with parents. It's supporting parents to understand things that we might find more obvious because we're educators that work best in supporting the children. So have a think about this. How can I communicate these things to parents? Something like just a simple weekly tip. You know, try and let your child hang their own coat up when they arrive at the setting this week. Something like that can be very helpful as well. Or sharing some of the things you do in your setting with parents and asking them to reinforce them at home. So, for instance, we do a weekly Macathon sign home to parents. We've been doing this Macathon sign in our setting. Can you support it at home? And all these things will feed into the development of self-regulation for your children. Now, in order to support the development of self-regulation, we need to figure out which bits of these skills the children are missing. And a really good way to do this is to view all behaviour as a form of communication. The younger the child, the less able they will be to coherently communicate using language what it is that they are thinking and feeling when they behave. But we can become almost what we might call child whisperers. We can look at a child's behaviours and consider what those behaviours are telling us about what the child needs. So, for instance, you have a child who every time they sit on the carpet, they're constantly wriggling, they're constantly fidgeting, they're constantly shoving their classmates and getting into trouble. And if we look at that behaviour as simply something to sanction, we miss a trick because the child is trying to tell us something about what we're asking them to do. Now, when you have a child who's struggling with a learning difficulty of some kind, so say they're struggling to learn to read, you don't sanction them for it, you put additional support in place. And this is exactly the same with behaviour. Behaviour is all about learning. Children are learning how to behave. Obviously, the older they get, the more you would expect them to have learned these things. And saying that behaviour is communication is not the same as saying you have to attend to everything that is communicated to you. So it might be sometimes that the kids are just feeling a bit bored and they're playing up because they're bored. And it might be actually quite good for them to have to learn a bit of patience to get through something that they find a bit dull. But often it's the case that the children are communicating something that we can have an influence on. So if, for instance, that wriggling child on the carpet has some kind of sensory difficulty with the texture of the carpet because they're wearing short trousers, then we could simply sit them on a cushion. We could encourage them to wear longer trousers. We could maybe get all the children up doing some movements if we think the wriggling is a sign that they've been sat still too long. So there's usually an answer to these questions if you think sideways and you see behaviour as a form of communication. The final idea in this video is about levels of challenge. And as we've seen throughout, one of the things that really does support the development of self-regulation is sufficient levels of physical and intellectual challenge. And sometimes I think in education we miss this kind of balance of mind and body. We are pushed perhaps by the curriculum, perhaps by statutory testing, perhaps just by the pressures of the job, to focus much more on the mind than on the body. Now, pitching the level of challenge high can be about thinking about environment as much as about activities. And just to give you one example of what I mean by this, each week in our setting, in our preschool, the children do a day of what we call Forest Club. It's essentially forest school provision, but we call it a club instead. Now, the levels of challenge that they face during that day are incredible. They are out there in all weathers, all times of the year. It's the winter now, and still they're out there every Friday, and they're not out there for just an hour or two. They're out there for a full day. And during that time, they do things like building dens, lighting fires, cooking their own food, thinking about keeping their hands clean when they go to eat, thinking about things like, how do they carry materials safely around the space, and so on. And what you can see there is a lovely match between the level of physical challenge of being in a tough environment that requires you to develop resilience against things like the cold or inclement weather, alongside intellectual challenges as well. And what can also happen when you have these challenging environments is the practitioners can narrate what's going on. So they can narrate how to safely carry a stick. They can narrate when they see a child facing a high level of challenge and coping well with it. They can narrate when they see a child doing well around failure. They can practice not being helicopters. They can practice allowing children to make genuine mistakes. So one of the things I would urge you to do if you're thinking about this development of self-regulation is to think about the times of day when your children do face really high levels of challenge. And this could well be during playtimes as well as in the classroom. Thinking about those intellectual challenges, I do think sometimes we underestimate children in what they can achieve intellectually. Now, this is not just about academic challenge in terms of, how much can they write or how well can they spell. It's about things like, the smallest of children will have memorised thousands of names of dinosaurs. And you get the youngest of children who can speak more than one language simply because of the challenge of the environment in which they have been brought up. Now, we tend to think of challenge as meaning, difficulty or problem, but actually challenge is all about, the sparks, the joy of life, the things that we have to figure out a way to work around. And those challenges can also be some of the most joyful moments of the work that we do as educators as well. There's a lovely thing you can do, which we talk a lot about in early years, which is called provocations. And this is where you set up a scenario for the children that provokes their thinking. So there's an animal stuck in a tree. How are we going to get it down? There's an alien spacecraft landed in our playground. How are we going to respond? There's a disaster and we're going to work as a team to go and help resolve it. So when you're thinking about self-regulation, don't just think about behaviours. Think about the level of challenge within your curriculum as well. So I'd like to thank you for listening to this video, and I hope that the practical ideas that I've given will support you in developing self-regulation for your children. And you might like to have a look at my latest book, which is all about this subject, and it's called Learning Behaviours, a practical guide to self-regulation in the early years. Thanks very much indeed for listening, and bye-bye.